This
I'm
conference
David
will now
Coburn.
be
I'm on
recorded.
the, pardon me? Oh, I'm on the board of the County Soil and Water Conservation District.
Thanks, Dave. Carol Biesmeyer?
Good afternoon, everyone. Carol Biesmeyer. I'm a member of Greening USA and interested to hear about this topic today. Thanks.
Thanks for being with us, Carol. Abdul?
Abdul Alamein. I'm a sustainability consultant. I'm currently taking a graduate course in energy law at Vermont Law School.
Great, thank you for joining us today. Bob Haley's with us once again.
Yeah. Hi, folks. Good to see everyone. I'm an architect and a former educator at Syracuse University and Colgate on sustainability issues, and yes, a proud member of Greening USA. And I'm interested in this topic because of everything behind and driving the big picture, in this case, utility rates and how it drives our entire economy, as well as, and one of the topics I'm looking forward to in the future is, and even possibly having a discussion, Diane, just to load the future coffers with subjects for John and Diane and everyone here, is the concept of embedded energy. I'd like to consider embedded energy as one of our future topics for focusing and communicating what that is and how it is a huge part of our energy future. So I see this as part of that kind of opening the door on larger context issues to sustainability. So thank you for this.
Thanks, Bob. Jesse Brill?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessie. I am a staff member for New York State Senator John Mannion, and I'm particularly interested in environmental policy. So that's why I'm here.
Hey, great. Thanks for joining us today. Dick?
Yeah, hi. I'm Dick Kornbluth. I am a retired home performance contractor. I am on the coordinating committee of the CNY Solidarity Coalition, and I'm on the steering committee of the Heat Smart CNY project.
Great, thanks for being with us today, Dick. And I think, I think Barry Lentz is also here.
Yep. Hi, Barry Lentz. I'm a member of Green USA, a member of Moving People Transportation Coalition, Mayor's I-81 Cooperative, Urban Jobs Task Force, and a bunch of other organizations engaged in various social justice and environmental justice projects.
Thanks for being with us here today, Barry. And seeing you reminds me that our next Green Bag Lunch will be held as the mayoral candidate forum on October. I gotta refresh and make sure I get the date. I get the date correct. October. We're doing that October 8th, I guess, and it's going to be. It's planned right now is in person. The notice about it is getting finalized as we speak and should get out to everybody next week. So stay tuned for that information. And maybe Diane, I don't know if you have anything that you want to say, but Green USA Board President Diane Brandley is running the controls today. And Diane, do you want to say hello?
Hello. I also wanted to say that we will be offering a virtual experience if you are unable to attend in person at the mayoral debate on October the 8th. So watch for that. There will be two separate signups. One would be for in-person, the other one is for the virtual sign up. And since our intrepid membership chair is not with us at the moment, he normally does our shameless self-promotion, so I'll do it. Greening USA is a 501c3 nonprofit, educational nonprofit in New York State. We've been around since 2004. Not one of us receives a penny for what we do. So membership dues go 100% to supporting what it is that we do to help educate Central New York, upstate New York about sustainability issues. So if you are not a member, thank you. For those who identified themselves as members, thank you, thank you. It keeps the lights on. If you're not a member, please consider becoming a member. You can just go to our website, greeningusa.org, and you can become a member there. I think that's all for me. Thanks for coming today.
Great.
Thanks for taking the time.
Great, thanks, Diane. And so today's program, utility rate cases where the rubber meets the road. Our speaker today will be Jessica Azulay, Executive Director of the Alliance for a Green Economy. The Alliance for a Green Economy, or AGREE as it's known, is a coalition of environmental, social justice, and anti-war organizations working together for a 100% renewable energy system in New York. Jessica comes to us from rural West Virginia, and I don't know what the relationship there is to green energy, but there's got to be something there in her genes from coming out of West Virginia. She moved to Syracuse, according to some information that I found, in 2002, and we're the better for it. She holds a bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College, where she focused on political economy and international economics. Jessica was a recipient of Greening USA's 2015 Sustaining Our Communities Award for her work on the Solarize Syracuse campaign, and also was a recipient of our 2020 awards for her work and AGREE's work on the Heat Smart campaign for Central New York.
Come on, my golly.
We've had Greening USA has had a long involvement with Jessica, as we were talking before the program began. From the history that I could find, going back to June of 2013, when we had a green bag lunch focused on energy usage and generation. Jessica was a member of that panel, and she also participated in a green bag lunch on the future energy policy in New York State in July of 2015. So I'm delighted to have Jessica back with us today to update us on what's going on with energy policy and particularly rates in New York State. Jessica, turn it over to you, and please feel free to correct anything that I mentioned here that might not be exactly correct.
I think everything you said is exactly correct. So you did very good research there. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be in this room of what sounds like really great minds, and I'm excited to talk about rate cases and how New York's energy policy and environmental policy is playing out on the ground. I just want to do a very quick sound check. You all hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Just let me know if something happens and you lose sound or something. So just want to get the controls going here so I can see my screen. Okay, great. So I think John did a great job of just describing what AGREE is, so thank you for that. We're a Syracuse-based organization, but we work statewide on state energy policy, and we are trying to move New York to 100% renewable energy in all sectors, so in the electric sector, the building sector, and the transportation sector. And I just want to start by just reviewing for everybody what our current state goals are by law. So in 2019, New York passed one of the most ambitious climate laws in the country, and it's called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, more commonly known as the CLCPA. And this law mandates that New York must get to 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and zero emissions electricity by 2040. And across the economy, we have to reach 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels by 2030 and 85% reduction in greenhouse gas levels by 2050. So those are the broad strokes of that climate law. The climate law also has some very strong provisions around environmental justice and requires that 40% of the benefits of this transition to renewable energy must go to disadvantaged communities. And there's a big process to identify those communities across the state. So this law has set into motion a lot of things, a lot of process. There's some sub goals under these goals as well for specific technologies. But this is kind of the high level mandated goals that we must reach by law as a state. And so then that, I think, leads us to ask, well, where are greenhouse gases coming from now? So this is the latest greenhouse gas accounting from the state. And this is a little bit redone from previous greenhouse gas emissions analyses because they are now, because of a provision in the CLCPA, accounting for methane differently. It used to be that they didn't account as much for the leaks in the transportation of methane, both upstream, like out of state and in state. And they also didn't used to count methane on a 20-year global warming potential. And so they have to do that now. And what that means is that the role of gas, called natural gas or fracked gas or methane gas or fossil gas, the role of that gas is much bigger in our greenhouse gas emissions accounting because we're properly accounting for the impact that it has on the climate. So as you can see here, the main drivers are our emissions. Over half of our emissions come from the buildings and the transportation sector. Together, they're about equal at this point. And we have some other kind of big slices, electricity, of course, and then waste. And then there's some smaller slices, industrial processes, agriculture, industry, and fugitive methane. And I think that fugitive methane, you know, some of that is associated with electricity and buildings, but it's got its own slice in the pie currently. So this is where our greenhouse gases are currently coming from. And you can see, I got this slide from a presentation that was made to the Climate Action Council, which is a state body that was appointed because of the CLCPA, and they're kind of in charge with creating a scoping plan for how New York is going to meet those ambitious climate goals. And they meet regularly and get presentations, and this was a presentation that I believe NYSERDA, but possibly DEC presented to the Climate Action Council, and you can find the whole presentation on the Climate Action Council's website. So in terms of thinking about how we're going to get to reducing all of that greenhouse gas from all of those sources, and particularly the sources that come from energy use. So that would be electricity generation, heating in our buildings, hot water, cooking, clothes drying, and some of the industrial process that happens in our industry, and then transportation. There's a lot of detail and implementation to be worked out, and but at a high level, experts that we have been hearing from for years kind of all agree on kind of some core pathways that have to happen all together at the same time. So this isn't necessarily one after the other, but we kind of need to do all this at the same time. So first we have to make sure that we're using energy as efficiently as possible. We need to conserve energy and implement weatherization and energy efficiency programs. At the same time, we need to electrify everything. So What that means is every place where we're burning fossil fuels on site, so burning fossil fuels in our furnaces, in our houses, or for heating our hot water, or for cooking, or in our lawnmowers or in our cars, we need to switch to an electric version of that, and preferably the most efficient electric version we can find. And then we can power all of those electrified things with 100% renewable electricity. And because renewable electricity is variable, right? The sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow, and there's seasonal differences in how much solar energy we get or how much wind energy we get at any given time of the year. We have to find ways to balance the system. So there's a lot of research and development going on in this area. Storage is one of the biggest ways to do this. There's also demand response, so changing when we use energy to match it up better with when renewable energy is being generated. There's a lot of different ways that humans are working to figure out how to balance out the variations in renewable energy. So that's the big picture pathway that we are working toward, to do all of these things at the same time. Now, what if I told you that many of the decisions related to decarbonizing our economy, so kind of following those pathways, were made in closed-door confidential meetings? I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear this. I certainly was when I realized that this was happening. But the good news is that anyone who wants to can actually go to those meetings. So you have to sign up, you have to become part of the process in order to get into the door, and you have to agree to keep things confidential, but you can get in. So where is this happening? It's happening in utility rate cases. And I'm going to talk a lot about what is going on in utility rate cases and what we've been doing in there. But first, I need to back up just a minute and do a very quick little Energy System 101 so that we are all on the same page about what I'm talking about. So just very quickly, most of you probably know this, but I think it's important to diagram it out. Just want to talk about how electricity gets to us. So it's generated in power plants, mostly large generating power plants in New York, centralized generation in different parts of the state. Some of these are dirty, some of these are clean. Increasingly, we're hoping to move toward clean versions. Then the electricity is transferred, transmitted, transported across big high voltage power lines until it gets to your local area, to your local utility company. So our local utility company is National Grid. And National Grid is also called a distribution utility company. And the reason for that is because it owns and operates these distribution lines, these smaller, lower voltage lines that get energy directly to our houses. And then of course, we, the customers, use it. And this is a simplified version. There's a lot of other complication here that I'm not going to go into, but I will just mention that some of this is being changed and disrupted by distributed energy. A lot of us have solar on our roofs or are participating in community renewable energy projects that are smaller than the large-scale centralized generation plants and are connected directly to the utilities distribution grid and not to the big high voltage power lines. So when I talk about utilities, I'm talking about the distribution utility companies like National Grid, Central Hudson, NYSEG, RG&E, Con Ed, etc. In New York, these distribution companies, for the most part, are not allowed to own generation. New York went through a deregulation process a few decades ago and separated the distribution utilities from the generation utilities. And those generation companies are now in a competitive market, and they are not owned, for the most part, by distribution utilities. There are a few exceptions. And most of the distribution utilities in New York are for-profit, investor-owned utilities. They're big corporations. Many of them are international. For instance, National Grid is a UK company, and there are a few public utilities. There's some small municipal utilities, and there's also the Long Island Power Authority, which is a larger publicly owned utility on Long Island, although it contracts out the running of its grid to a private company. On the gas side, it's very similar. So on the gas side, natural gas or fracked gas or methane gas or fossil gas, whatever we want to call it, most of it is extracted through fracking at this point, a lot in Pennsylvania. It comes to us through big interstate pipelines, and then it gets to the smaller pipelines, the distribution lines that are owned by our utility company, National Grid again. In Syracuse, we have the same gas and electric distribution utility, but not all places do. For instance, in Buffalo, National Grid is the electric utility and National Fuel is the gas utility. And then it gets to us. And of course, this is also being disrupted somewhat by the rise of geothermal energy and air source heat pumps, where customers are switching their heating sources over to heat pumps and then getting the energy for their heat from the earth and the air and from the electricity grid. And then, of course, there are some customers that heat with oil and other fossil fuels that are not delivered through a distribution utility. And we have kind of the same structure for gas utilities in New York, where the distribution utility companies are not the owners. They're not generally the frackers, and they don't own the big interstate transmission pipelines. They're just the owners of the distribution lines that get the energy from those interstate pipelines to our homes. So just to review, when I talk about utilities today, I'm talking about electric and gas distribution utilities, which are the businesses that deliver energy to our houses and other buildings. So let's just talk about the role of utilities in implementing our climate law. So I just listed some. There's actually a lot more, but I think these are the big ones. So as we think about how we're moving to a more efficient energy system and electrifying everything and getting to more and more renewable energy, and balancing out the variability of renewables, you can think about all the ways that distribution utilities touch that transition. So the utilities are the ones that fund and administer most of the energy efficiency programs. They fund and administer most of the heat pump incentives in New York at this point. They incentivize electric vehicle charging stations and can promote electric vehicles. They're the interconnection point for distributed renewable electricity. Their rate structures also influence customer behavior. How your rates are structured can create an incentive or a barrier to energy efficiency, conservation, electrification, and distributed renewable energy. And I'll just go into that a little bit more. So for National Grid, for instance, if you ever look at your National Grid bill in detail, you'll see that for instance, your electricity portion of your bill has some pieces of the bill that are fixed. There's a customer charge, I believe it's $17 for National Grid, that never changes. No matter how much energy you use or don't use, you always have to pay that. You also always have to pay that even if you have solar on your roof and you generate enough energy to cover throughout the year your entire usage. You still have to pay $17 a month, even if all the rest of your charges are netted out through net metering. And then the rest of your bill is based on how much energy you use. So if you're, what that means is that, I'm not sure why my computer is doing that. Okay, so what that means is that the higher that fixed rate is, the less economical the less incentive you have to save energy, and the less economical putting solar on your roof becomes. And so that's just an example of a rate structure that can influence either by incentivizing or creating a barrier to efficiency or renewables. So utilities also are the default energy supplier for customers. You can choose an ESCO as well, but most people use the default of the utility. And suppliers enter into bilateral contracts with generators, so they do have some relationship sometimes with the actual utility scale generators. Utilities promote, there's a lot of marketing that they do of methane gas and conversions from oil to gas, and I'll be getting into this, and some are starting to move away from that. So they have a big influence on customer behavior and what customers know about their options. They also are a point of information in marketing when people need energy and are considering their different energy choices. And last but not least, they have enormous political influence. So having gone through just some of the ways that utilities, some of the main ways that utilities kind of touch our energy transition, you know, if you kind of go back to the thinking about where our greenhouse gas emissions come from, you can see that utilities really do touch a big piece of this. They certainly touch the buildings piece. They're the deliverer of the fuel for most of the buildings in New York, the fuel that we burn in our buildings for heat or for thermal energy, cooking, clothes drying, hot water and heating. They also are the deliverer. They deliver electricity and have a lot of influence over a piece of our transition to renewable energy in the distributed energy realm. And they touch on the utility realm as well. And they also, as we electrify our transportation, they're going to be the provider of all of the electricity for that transportation. And they have a role in helping us move toward an electrified transportation sector. So what influences utility behavior? I mentioned that most of the utilities in New York are for-profit, shareholder-owned companies. And what that means is that they are very influenced by their shareholders and what their shareholders want and what's in the interest of their shareholders. They are also influenced by the laws of the state and by the regulations of the state. And that's where rate cases really come into play. And they are somewhat influenced by wanting to project a certain public image. So we've seen that some utilities have more of an interest in looking greener than other utilities. I want to talk a little bit about how utilities are regulated. So they're regulated by a state agency called the Public Service Commission. There are currently 7 members of the Public Service Commission. These are all appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, and got them listed there. These are the ultimate decision makers, and they meet once a month and vote on many issues that relate to utilities. And they do so through a few different kinds of decision-making processes. One is generic policy proceedings, which apply to all utilities. So an example of that is in 2020, there was an order from the commission developing an energy efficiency policy and with a statewide target for how much energy efficiency we need to achieve and what the budget for that is going to be. And that generic proceeding applies to all utilities and then broke that target up across all utilities and assigned targets and budgets to all utilities. The budgets to be paid for by all utility ratepayers, that's us, the customers, and the targets to be met by utility programs. That's an example. There's many generic policy proceedings that happen every year that relate to our energy transition. They also run investigations. They can look into wrongdoing by a company. And then the biggie is rate cases. rate cases deal with the rates, the investments, and the programs of a particular utility. And so theoretically, utilities would file a rate case every year if they want to change their rates. These are, because they're monopoly companies, there's only one for each region. They're regulated in terms of what they can charge, so they can't just charge whatever they want. And so in rate cases, the commission is ultimately going to decide what the rates are going to be and their investments, what investments they can pay for with those rates and the programs that they can pay for. So what happens in a rate case is that a distribution utility decides it wants to change its rates. It makes a filing, and that starts a rate case. And the filing will have a lot of detail about why they want to change their rates, all of the activities that they're going to do, their capital budgets, their operation budgets, a lot of financial information and description about their programs. These rate cases involve hundreds of millions of dollars, and they involve programs and investments that are really going to impact our energy future. And that's all included in the filing. These are processes where the public can get involved by intervening in a rate case or by showing up at public hearings. If you intervene, and I'll get into that a little bit more, you can ask questions, you can participate in negotiations, you can make your own case with expert testimony, etc. And then ultimately, within about a year, the Public Service Commission makes an ultimate decision on how much the utility can change its rates, usually going up, but occasionally going down, but almost usually going up, and what they can pay for. So that's kind of the basic of the rate case process. And I said that this can happen every year, but in reality, what happens in New York is it happens about every 3 years for each utility. So I just want to recognize this quote. This is Joe Biden's dad, actually. It's a lot of times attributed to Joe Biden himself, but he attributes it to his dad. And it says, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." And I think this is very applicable to rate cases, because rate cases really are the budget for our climate crisis right now. So in a rate case, which is largely a financial conversation, we are talking about how much the utility can collect and spend of customer money. But customers don't govern utilities unless it's a public utility. Shareholders do. So the utility's goal is to make money for its investors. And it does that by taking their investors' money and investing it in capital projects like pipelines and wires, and then charging customers interest on that investment for decades to pay the shareholders back with a return on equity. So the companies, what we've seen is that they are usually looking for a way to justify building more infrastructure. They do this by showing demand forecasts that show increasing demand, and then justifying that they need to build more infrastructure to meet that demand. They do it by saying that they need to repair or replace their infrastructure that's wearing out or that's somehow dangerous. And then one that we're seeing more and more is to build redundancy and resilience into the system. Now, all of these are potentially justifiable reasons to build infrastructure, and especially on the electric side, where we do expect, as we electrify everything, to need to build our electric infrastructure to be able to provide that electricity. But we have seen that in some cases, especially on the gas side, we need to move away from gas, but utilities, because they want to build more infrastructure so that their investors can invest their money and get paid back with a return on equity, are finding all kinds of ways to continue to invest as much as possible into the gas system, even though we almost certainly need to phase out that gas system by 2050. And we need to dramatically reduce it by 2030. The utility also gets to recover all of its operating costs. So all of the programs and operations that, if it wants to redo its website or create a customer support program, there's lots and lots of operating costs as well that go into a rate case. So I want to give an example because I've talked in theoretical terms for a little while. National Grid Upstate, our own utility, has a rate case going on right now. They filed last summer, at the end of the summer, and they want to raise bills by about an average, for the average customer that gets both gas and electric, bills would go up about $100 a year. They want to make some big investments in the gas infrastructure. We added up just over the next few years, they would amount to about $1.4 billion investment in gas capital projects. And a big driver of this is leak-prone pipe. So there's a lot of old pipe that it's not necessarily leaking, but it could leak. It's prone to leak because it's made of an old material. And it's been the policy of New York to try to get as much of that pipe out of the ground and replace it with newer material. So a big driver of that is leak-prone pipe. They also want to make investments in the electric infrastructure. And they had some novel programs that they are proposing under the rubric of the future of heat. One is a pilot program to put individual carbon capture technology on individual furnaces inside people's houses, to partner with a private company to try that. There's a lot of problems with it. They also want to pilot a geothermal district system. So a shared community, maybe more than one, shared community geothermal system where people can, the utility would own a shared loop that has thermal energy running through it, and customers would purchase their own heat pump equipment and connect to that loop and pay a monthly cost to get thermal energy from the loop. And they're also proposing a multi-use hydrogen facility where they want to use renewable energy to create hydrogen and inject some of that hydrogen into the gas system. They say as a way to decarbonize the gas system, and also use that hydrogen for other uses like fuel cells and stuff like that. So that's an example. There's a lot more in the National Grid rate case. I could probably do a whole presentation on the National Grid case, but this is just an example of one utility's proposals and how they may or may not comply or move us toward meeting our greenhouse gas reduction target. So rate cases from the outside, if you don't really know much about the process, you may see in the media when a utility files to raise the rates. There's usually some level of media coverage when a utility says, hey, we want to raise the rates by $100 a year. And so that's often how people know that something is happening. The Public Service Commission also holds they're called public statement hearings. They'll usually, in the communities that are covered in that utility territory, they'll show up for an evening or an afternoon or both. The utility will make a presentation about what it wants to do, and then people will be given some short period of time, like 3 minutes each or 5 minutes each, to say what they think about it. And there's a reporter there who makes a transcript, and there's usually administrative law judges, and sometimes one, maybe if we're lucky, two of the commissioners actually there listening to the public. And you can also put public comments into the docket. And then there's like a long period of silence, usually months, and then a decision by the Public Service Commission. And a lot of people, and I included, thought this was the whole of the process because this is what it looks like from the outside. So before I ever intervened in a rate case, I thought the public hearings were the way to influence what was happening, and I you know, would try to organize people for it. And I thought, you know, that was our biggest way and the biggest way for the public to make an impact on the decision that's made by the Public Service Commission. But in reality, that's not how decisions are made. What's really happening in a rate case is happening in a much more legalistic and technical space, and where it all comes down and where the decisions are actually made, the majority of them is at a negotiating table. So what happens is when the utility files its filing, anybody, an individual, an organization, a municipality, a company, whatever, whoever you are, you can sign up to become a party to the case, an intervener in the case. And that gives you the ability to make your own expert testimony, hitting back against things that the utility wants to do that you think are not a good idea, or agreeing with the utility. You can hire your own expert, or you can be your own expert. You can introduce evidence into the case. You can do discovery, which means you can ask questions of the utility and they have to answer in writing within a certain time period. And most importantly, you get invited to negotiations which happen in almost every rate case in New York at this point, where all of the parties sit down and instead of hashing all their issues out in front of a judge to be decided by the commission in the end, they sit down at a negotiating table and create a proposal together to put before the commission. And that negotiation goes on for months. Usually it is very detailed, it is very time consuming, but the people in the room are the ones that really influence what gets put into that proposal. And in the end, as what usually happens, many groups will sign on to that proposal. The company will sign on to that proposal. The Department of Public Service, which is representing the public and the state, will sign on to that proposal. And that proposal goes before the commission. And it's very difficult for public comments or what was said in the public statement hearing for 3 minutes at a time per person to have a lot of weight against the proposal that was hashed out based on expert testimony and sitting at the negotiating table for months together. So what I have seen, we've been intervening in rate cases since 2017. What I have seen is that really what ultimately decides what goes down in a rate case is the state's position, the utility's position, and who else is at the table and what goes on in those negotiations. And then those negotiations are only open to active parties of the case, but like I said, anyone can become a party, and they're confidential. So what goes on at that table cannot be talked about publicly, not during the case and not after the case. So like I said, anyone can intervene in a rate case. You just ask to become a party, and that gives you the ability to conduct discovery and find out information from the utility or from other parties, the state included, to submit expert testimony, to negotiate, and to eventually litigate any decision that comes down from the commission that you feel breaks the law. So I want to talk about what has been accomplished in rate cases. So as I mentioned, AGREE has been intervening in rate cases since 2017. And the reason we intervened in our first case was the Upstate National Grid case in 2017. And we had previously been participating in generic policy proceedings at the commission. And we kept hearing this word rate cases, where the commission would make some big grand kind of policy ruling that had, maybe some detail, but maybe not that much detail in terms of how it would actually be implemented, but would set some policy in motion or some framework in motion, and then it would say something like, and then each utility in its rate case will, do blah, blah, blah. And I was kind of like, what is a rate case? So I decided to, when I saw that National Grid filed a rate case in 2017, I decided to become a party, mostly to figure out what it was, and to see what the opportunities were for organizing and for influencing the outcome of the rate case. And since then, we have participated in almost every rate case in the state, because what we found is that a lot happens in a rate case, as I've mentioned, and that by becoming a party, you actually win the ability to have a lot of influence over the outcome of the case. So I want to talk about some of the things that have been accomplished by groups joining as in rate cases and being part of those negotiations. So NYSEG RG&E is a really good example. This was a case, I believe it was filed in 2019. We intervened in this case in collaboration with multiple organizations in the NYSEG and RG&E territory, who all of us having a common interest of trying to align the company and move the company toward working toward our climate goals. This was before, they filed before the CLCPA was passed, but the CLCPA was passed by the legislature during the rate case. So based on a lot of great organizing, testimony, and negotiation, what we came out of that case with was the company agreeing to plan for zero net increase in billed gas use. So what that means is their gas usage, they're trying to keep their gas sales from increasing. And the way they're doing that is for customers, for the number of customers that they forecast would hook up to the gas system over time, they're trying to reduce the same amount of gas through energy efficiency, heat pumps, and other initiatives to try to keep their sales from going up. This was a huge breakthrough. This was the first time a utility in New York, and where I've heard of anywhere, although I won't say it hasn't happened in other places, but this is the first time I know of a utility agreeing to stop growing its gas business, basically. They also agreed to study what would be needed to reduce gas usage over time and increase electricity usage as an alternative, and what would be needed to be done to modernize and expand the electric grid. They canceled funding that they had proposed for two controversial pipelines, the Lansing pipeline and the De Ruyter pipeline, and agreed not to fund it within the 3-year term of the agreement, and to not apply for permits for those pipelines. They agreed essentially to stop promoting gas within a year on their website and other marketing within a year of the commission decision, which is we're about nearing a year now. So soon we hope to see that implemented. They also are doing a feasibility study for deploying geothermal district energy systems, and they're hoping to do a pilot if they find something where it's feasible. They agreed to end their oil to gas conversion incentives, and they agreed to a $1.5 million program for low-income heat pumps. They also agreed for most new pipeline projects that they might foresee needing to do that would involve the replacement or an expansion of an existing pipeline, that they would look for a non-pipe alternative. They would see if they could find another way to provide energy to people, either by reducing the demand through energy efficiency or just taking people off the pipes completely through heat pumps or other technologies to try to avoid additional pipeline investments. So that was our first case. We had gotten some previous little things out of rate cases before the NYSEG RG&E case. We'd gotten increases in heat pump incentives and other things like that. But this was the first case where we felt like we really saw a significant change in the utilities kind of plans and behaviors by organizing and getting lots of people into the rate case and into the negotiation. A more sober example is the National Grid downstate case. So National Grid owns two gas utilities in the downstate region that serve New York City and Long Island. They are not the electric provider in those areas. Electricity is provided by Con Ed and LIPA. In that case, which just wrapped up this summer, there was a huge legal battle over whether the CLCPA even applied to rate cases. And we had the state lawyers arguing, surprisingly, that maybe the CLCPA does not apply to rate cases. And we fought that really hard throughout the summer, and ultimately the commission ruled with us that rate cases must comply with the CLCPA. So that was a very big, significant piece of progress that we got out of the National Grid downstate case. However, that was kind of the end of it. The National Grid agreed to reduce gas sales 0.5% from forecast, which sounds good in for a second, but then if you look at how much they were planning to grow in their forecast, you realize that 0.5% is not that much, and that they will still be continuing to grow their gas business and gas sales. They also got approval for hundreds of millions of dollars of new infrastructure costs, projects that they had already built and put in the ground while the case was being negotiated. And they retroactively got approval to charge customers for those controversial gas expansion projects. We did get some possibility that future projects will be harder for them. They're going to have to jump through some hoops in order to get cost recovery for some of their future gas infrastructure projects. They need to have there's going to be an independent consultant that will look to see if their demand is really there to justify those projects. They have to meet some energy efficiency and electrification goals, but we're not sure how that's all going to work out. And they're going to study the company's greenhouse gas emissions so that in the future they can plan for how to reduce them. And there's some non-pipe alternatives in there as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag. We did not sign on to the settlement in the National Grid case, and we opposed it because we did not think it complied with the CLCPA. We did sign on to the NYSEG RG&E settlement. And then most recently, the most recent case to wrap up and to be submitted for commission approval. The commission hasn't approved this yet, but there's a joint proposal that came out of negotiations that was signed on to by almost all the parties in the case, including us. So Central Hudson is going to inventory all of its direct and indirect emissions and develop a plan to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions relative to 2019 activity, which is great, but they're not just planning. They're actually committing to reducing their gas sales, billed gas usage, 2.5% from 2019 levels over the next few years, which is small when you think about we need to reach 40% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. But this is the first time a utility has agreed to reduce gas sales and to work toward that. So we see this as significant progress. And we also know that we're going to start out slow in our reductions and our ability to move to electrified heating and cooking, but we hope to accelerate and scale over time. And so we think this is a step in the right direction and a turning point for utilities to have a utility agree to start reducing its gas sales. They're also reducing their electric, or they're increasing their electric energy efficiency programs and targets over what they're already required to do. They're decommissioning some of their gas-powered power plants. I mentioned that usually utilities don't own power plants, but there's a few exceptions. They're trying to increase electric vehicle adoption, and they're they're working to electrify their own fleet of vehicles. And they're also implementing a new gas rate structure. So if you look at if you have a natural gas bill from National Grid, and you look at it really carefully, it's a little hard to discern, but you'll discover that actually the more gas you use, the cheaper the gas gets, which is really the wrong way. It's kind of the wrong direction in terms of our reaching our climate goals, right? We need people to be conserving fossil fuels and conserving energy and not incentivizing them to use more. So what's happening in Central Hudson is they're phasing in, they're eliminating their declining block rate. That kind of rate where the more you use, the cheaper each unit gets. That's called a declining block rate. So they're eliminating that on a phased-in basis. And they're also continuing to support community solar and pursuing non-pipe alternatives. And they are offering gas efficiency incentives, but no incentives for customers to convert from oil to gas. We have a lot of utilities still, although it's changing one utility at a time through the rate cases, provide incentives to move people from oil to gas. But the latest greenhouse gas accounting from the state shows that there's actually no environmental benefit to gas in terms of greenhouse gases compared to oil. And so that is a lateral move in terms of greenhouse gases. It's not good for the environment. We need to be moving people off of oil and onto heat pumps and off of gas onto heat pumps. So ending incentives for oil to gas is really important. And they're also modifying their website to remove oil to gas conversion kind of promotional language, and they're removing claims that gas is environmentally friendly when compared to other fossil fuels. So I'm going to wrap up momentarily, but I just want to say that rate case decisions, what goes on in these negotiations and the outcomes of them really reflect state policy and state generic proceedings, but they also influence them. And this is a kind of cycle that happens. So I mentioned the Public Service Commission makes broad policy and generic proceedings that apply to all utilities, but often the details about the implementation of that policy are worked out in the rate cases. And that can really influence then from case to case to case how utilities actually operate. So what we've seen is that when we get a good outcome in one case in terms of the implementation of a generic policy proceeding, that sets us up well to get a similar good outcome for how the next utility will implement that policy. And then we also see that when we can get utilities to do innovative things or new things through rate cases by organizing and pressuring them and participating in negotiations, that piloting or that initial stuff happening in one utility can, even if it's not part of or related to a generic proceeding, if it's successful or if multiple utilities start to do that thing, it will eventually end up in a generic proceeding. So we've seen a real give and take and a good or sometimes bad cycle between generic proceedings and rate cases, and they really do influence each other. So what's holding us back from getting more from the rate cases? I'll say state law. So we have a good climate law, which is great, but we do have some pieces of state law that conflict with the climate law. You know, one piece of that is that there's a rule that utilities have to hook up new gas customers to their system. It's written into state law, and they have to give you a free gas hookup if you're within 100 feet of the gas system. So that drives a lot of people to switch to gas from oil, or to, when they're building a new building, get onto gas. Because the utilities, even though we have a law that says we have to basically phase out fossil fuels, utilities still have to hook new customers up, and they have to give free hookups, which are subsidized by the rest of the ratepayers if you're within 100 feet of the system. So that's a conflict that we're grappling with and trying to work around in rate cases, but it does hold us back. Public Service Commission regulations and different generic proceedings that have not yet been changed to comply with the CLCPA also hold us back. There's a lot of inertia of just, this is how we've always done things. This is how utilities have always operated. This is how, we're used to the process going. That gets on our way when we're trying to change the status quo and move things in a different direction. Rate cases are a hidden and complex process. What the public sees from the outside is not really what's happening on the inside, and there isn't a lot of talk publicly about what's going on actually in rate cases. And even if you know and you want to participate, it is very complicated and time consuming. The barrier to participation, just in terms of time, is very high. And then because of that, we don't have enough people who are at the table, who hold policy expertise or on the ground expertise, or who are customers of the utility or represent interests within the utility territory, to sit in those negotiating rooms and push back and push for progress. So if you are interested and want to get involved, the most simple thing you can do is make a comment on the current National Grid rate case. I put a link in the presentation for where you can comment. But if you want to go deeper, you can participate in advocacy at the Public Service Commission around the generic policy proceedings, or you can join a rate case. And if you're interested in that, we are definitely here to help. So with that, I will end, and I think we have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It's a very informative and interesting presentation you gave us today. There were a couple of questions already in the chat, and we'll just take care of these. I think they were relative to things you mentioned in your slides. Barry Lentz asked, do you know the relation between the projected value of the proposed rate increase and the projected cost of investment? I think that was relative to the National Grid case.
Right, yes, so it was. And just wondering, in general too, is there any sense of when a case is considered, the relationship between what may be considered to be the investment that's behind the rate increase plus or relationship to general profit? I mean, presumably you can't get rate increases just because you want to increase your profit. And so how does that get worked out in this particular case? What does it look like?
So the utility has to file, when they file their rate case, they file a request for, here's our capital budget. So that's part of what drives the increase. And, capital expenditures don't hit the rates all at once, right? If the company wants to build a multi-million-dollar pipeline, they'll start and they get approval. They put the money down, and then we pay it back in our rates over many, many years, decades. So there isn't like a one-to-one, I hope I'm answering their question. There isn't like a one-to-one relationship with, we're planning $1.4 billion of investment, and we want $1.4 billion of rate increases. On the gas side, I think the rate increase associated with those investments is more like 40 million for 1 year. But they also are asking for an increase to their return on equity. So that does also drive the rate increase. The rate increases, the rates are kind of set by, here's the general amount of in order to sustain and pay back all the investments that the company has made and cover their operating costs and cover the energy efficiency programs and all the stuff that they have to do, here's how much money they need to collect from customers this year or next year. And then that goes through a process of revenue allocation and rate design where they allocate those costs across different kinds of customers, and then develop a rate design for how they're going to collect it from customers. It's a very complicated process, but they do lay it all out in their filing. And then people can disagree, right? So if they ask for a certain return on equity and we disagree that that's not an appropriate return, we can file testimony that says that's a ridiculous return on equity. You need it should be lower, and here's why. Or that all those capital projects are not projects that you actually need. Here's our proof. You know, we can file evidence, or you're not complying with the climate law, and here's what it would take to comply with the climate law, and this is what you need to do instead. And then it all gets hashed out, usually in the negotiations, and a joint proposal is put forward. I hope that answers your question.
Well, the short story is it's complicated, I guess.
It's complicated.
Thank you, Barry and Jess. Dick asked the question, how much did the final agreement with NYSEG RGE rate case differ from the original application?
Oh man, Dick, you're making me think back too many years. So it differed quite a bit. It had a much lower rate increase. And actually, in the case of the NYSEG RG&E, sorry, there's something weird going on with my computer. Okay, hopefully that's back now. So in the case of NYSEG RG&E, we signed on to the gas side of the case and not onto the electric side, because the rates came down enough in the gas side, but the electric rates in the final proposal were too high still in our point of view. But the rates did get reduced, and there were pipelines that had been proposed that the company basically canceled for the next 3 years. All of the climate study and the zero net gas growth, that was not in their original filing at all. They were planning to grow. They were planning to continue to market gas. That got changed. Their gas capital budget got cut a lot in order to bring down the rates. I can't remember by how many hundreds of millions, but it was a lot. So, the agreements in the end tend to differ pretty significantly from the company's original filing.
Yeah, thanks. Can I ask just a quick follow-up question on a very general subject?
Sure, go ahead.
When a rate case is decided, what's the frequency with which the utilities actually submit a rate case? In other words, when the case is decided, for how long do those changes hold before the utility then resubmits?
So theoretically, if the utility were to follow a process where there was no negotiated agreement, it could happen every year. One thing to know is that rate cases happen on the company's timeline. If they're happy with the rates that they have, they don't have to file. They can just stay out and not file a case. So there's nothing that requires them to come in every year with a new proposal. And often the agreements that happen through negotiations will be for a longer term. So even though, without an agreement, they could file every year if they want to, often the agreements cover 3 years. Most of the agreements in New York have recently covered 3 years. So as part of the negotiated outcome, the utility agrees not to file for new rates for 3 years, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're generally happening on a 3-year cycle. There's one exception right now, which is Corning Gas, which is a small utility they did not come to a joint proposal. The parties could not agree, and they put the entire thing to a litigated before an administrative law judge and decision by the commission. And I believe Corning Gas has already now filed again because that, they only got rates for a year.
Okay, just one last question. It seems to me ultimately the law of the land is the CLCPA. And regardless of what the utilities want or think they want, doesn't that essentially in the end trump whatever their desires are, because that they have to, the law is the law, and they have to ultimately, I would assume, conform to the requirements of the CLCPA?
Dick, I wish it was that simple. I think we all thought that it should be that simple and still think it, but that's not how it's exactly playing out. So what needs to happen is that the commission needs to set regulations that comply with the law and that regulate the utilities into compliance with the law. And the commission hasn't done that for most aspects of the CLCPA yet. And we don't know when they're going to do that, because we think they should do it now and then adjust over time. But because there's this process in the CLCPA of the Climate Action Council and the scoping plan, what we've been hearing from the commission and from the state lawyers is that, they're it would be premature for them to create regulations to comply with the CLCPA before the Climate Action Council puts out its plan. And so we're in this gray area. In the meantime, there is Section 7 of the CLCPA that basically says all state agencies must, I'm not going to get the language exactly right, but the gist of it is all state agencies have to make sure their actions are aligned with the CLCPA and are not going against the CLCPA. And if they do, for some reason, need to do something that kind of harms our ability to meet the goals of the CLCPA, they have to find ways to mitigate that. That's what that fight in National Grid was over, whether Section 7 applies to rate cases and whether the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission need to right now look at rate cases and figure out whether the proposals from the utilities or the joint proposals that are put before them that come out of negotiations, whether those could jeopardize our ability to meet the 2030 targets and the 2050 targets. And they have to somehow make a finding that they don't. And we were not happy. We were happy that out of the National Grid downstate case, we got a very strong ruling from the commission that Section 7 does apply to rate cases, but they still then turned around and approved this joint proposal that has gas increases. So it's a mixed bag, and the commission has not fully, I think, we don't see the CLCPA, even though it's law, being treated with the same weight as other laws that affect utilities and the Public Service Commission.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
And that's why we even have to be in these cases to fight tooth and nail. I mean, I wish that it's a huge undertaking and a huge amount of time, and I wish we didn't have to do it. I wish that the state was doing it, but they're not.
And perhaps that discussion answers Carol's question, what she said. She asked, like, how and how well are the rate case decisions enforced? And if you think that you've covered that with what you just talked about with Section 7 and the follow-up.
So the rate case decisions are basically they ultimately get incorporated into orders from the Public Service Commission, and those kind of have the same weight as like when a judge issues a ruling. So once a rate case order comes down and it says, we adopt this joint proposal that came out of negotiations, or we adopt it with some modifications, because sometimes they modify it. that does kind of have the force of regulation, and the utilities are expected to comply. How well they comply is really subject to how well the state does a good job of tracking their compliance and making sure that they're complying, or how well interveners like us are tracking. So the NYSEG RG&E case is a very good example. As part of that joint proposal for net zero growth in gas, they have to report quarterly on their gas sales, normalized for weather, and on their heat pumps and energy efficiency programs. And we read those reports every quarter to see if they're complying. And we're also, we're waiting with bated breath to see what they're going to do with their marketing and how their marketing and website is going to comply with that terms of the joint proposal and many other pieces. Sometimes it's on us to kind of track that, but we would hope that the state is also tracking it and holding them to it. And if they break it, we haven't done this yet, but we'll see how well it goes. If they break it, I think we can go to the commission, we can file something and say this company is not complying with this agreement that it signed.
Jess, how well funded is the PSC staff? I mean, do they have enough staff to do what is required?
They are, I can't remember how many staffers there are, but they're a big agency. But I would say that they probably are not funded enough to do what's necessary right now. The expectation, there's so much of the climate law that is gonna come down to the Public Service Commission. The DEC also has a huge piece of it. They're doing all this emissions accounting and gonna set emissions limits in line with the CLCPA, and they have control over permitting of some of the environmental permitting over power plants. But the Public Service Commission also has permitting authority over power plants, and they have to do all the energy. They have to make all this energy efficiency happen. They have to make all these heat pumps happen. They have to get to 70% renewable electricity through the Clean Energy Standard proceeding. There are countless proceedings going on at the Public Service Commission to try to, at a generic level, to try to move us toward these goals, or not move us toward the goals if you read some of them. And then there's these rate cases. And then there's the investigations and holding the utilities, checking up on them and making sure they're doing what they need to do. I don't think they have enough staff to do all of that and do it well.
Yeah, sort of related then, is there financial support for the interveners from some pot of money?
I wish. So New York has intervener funds for siting cases. So when a power plant or a power line wants to be built, when a company wants to build it, they have to pay into an intervener fund to help fund interveners in that case. But for rate cases and generic policy proceedings, there are not intervener funds. And we fought the commission over this for a number of years, saying that there should be, and we lost. And it would probably take an act of the legislature to create these intervener funds, and it's really unfair. And I think the biggest injustice of it is that because of the way utility regulation works, and I can talk about this for years, but I won't. Because of the way it works, the utility gets to pass pretty much all of its costs onto its customers, and that includes the lawyer fees and all of the costs related to a rate case. So preparing that rate filing and asking to raise our rates and then defending that and negotiating it, all of the money that's paid for that within the company and to any outside lawyers, they get to charge to us, the public. And so, Meanwhile, the public's money isn't going to pay interveners who are working in the public interest and who are on the ground, maybe representing the interests of customers in a particular region. So it's frustrating. And I think it's a really big barrier and a reason why more groups are not able to be at the table and be represented in these proceedings.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I had jotted down a question earlier when you were talking about the whole negotiation process, and I don't know that you can answer it because of the confidentiality agreements, but I was going to ask, like, what people are in the room, what groups are usually in those rooms.
Yeah, I can speak to that kind of on a broad basis. I can't say what those groups say in those rooms or what they propose in those rooms, but you can look for in any utility rate case, like who the parties are, and that is public knowledge. There's the Department of Public Service staff. So this is the experts and lawyers that work for the Department of Public Service. They're a big player, obviously. Then there's another state agency, the Utility Intervention Unit, which is an arm of the Department of State, which works for the interests of low-income customers. The Public Utility Law Project, which is a great organization that represents low-income customers and really works to defend their rights and try to bring down rates, are usually, I think, pretty much in all rate cases. Agree has been the only environmental group in all of the major rate cases in New York for the last few years, but there are sometimes other environmental organizations, depending on how big the case is. Some of the bigger environmental organizations get involved. Sometimes they don't. We work to try to get as many local groups involved as we can. And then the big power consumers are represented. So there's a group called Multiple Interveners, which represents big businesses that use a lot of energy, some of them for profit, some of them nonprofit, and they represent their interests. I'm trying to think what else. Sometimes NYPA is involved in these cases, the New York Power Authority, which works with municipalities on their energy stuff, including trying to help municipalities buy back their street lights, which again has a big intersection with utilities. The Geothermal Energy Organization, New York Geothermal Energy Organization, has been recently, kind of around the same time frame that we started getting involved in rate cases. They did too. Sometimes electric vehicle companies are in there. The ESCOs are sometimes in there. Sometimes real estate interests are there. It's kind of a mixture.
Well, it sounds like there's a pretty good representation from the community that is interested in seeing some changes made in what we're doing to try to meet the intent of the the climate crisis. So yeah, that's good. Are there any other questions from we have lost a few people and we're also lost most of our time. A couple of minutes remaining, but in that couple of minutes, if anybody has another question, and if we don't, that's okay too. And I will let's see. Post contact information, Abdul, for Jessica. Sure, yeah, we can get that out. Jess, do you want to do that, or do you want me to?
I'm putting it in the chat right now.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I will just say thank you to Jess. I suppose we could all unmute and give her a round of applause. Which, if we were
Well
in
done.
person,
Well
we would be able to do that. We're still wrestling with the in-person thing. As we said earlier, the mayoral forum is intended to be an in-person event. At this point, we will also have a virtual stream of it in real time as well. So look forward for the information about that, and look forward to maybe getting together in person, all of us someday. So keep your fingers crossed, keep wearing your masks, get your vaccinations, and let's beat the pandemic. But let's keep going on the PSC to meet the intent of the climate law. So thanks very much, Jess. I really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.